In a quiet little town where everyone seemed to know each other, trouble was brewing at the local high school. The students had been buzzing about Maya Johnson, a bright and confident 16-year-old with an infectious smile and a head full of thick, curly hair that she wore proudly. To Maya, her hair wasn't just hair, it was part of who she was. It represented her culture, her identity, and her pride in being exactly who she was meant to be. But not everyone saw it that way. At the school, there were strict rules about appearances, rules that some people thought were outdated or unfair. One day, Maya's afro hairstyle caught the attention of the principal, who decided it didn't meet the neatness standards outlined in the student handbook. Maya tried to explain that her hair was natural and perfectly fine, but her protests fell on deaf ears. Before long, the matter escalated beyond what anyone expected. Enter Officer Karen Miller, a no-nonsense police officer assigned to handle disciplinary issues at the school. Known for her sharp tongue and rigid approach, Karen wasn't someone you'd want to cross paths with on a bad day. When she arrived at the school office, she took one look at Maya and immediately sided with the administration. "This isn't acceptable," Karen declared, glaring at Maya as if she'd committed a crime. Maya felt her heart sink. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, sitting in front of this intimidating woman who clearly didn't understand or care about the significance of her hair. Despite Maya's calm explanations and pleas, Karen refused to listen. Instead, she insisted that drastic action needed to be taken to set an example. Before Maya could even process what was happening, Karen grabbed a pair of scissors from the desk and announced that Maya's hair would have to go. Students gathered outside the office gasped in horror as they watched through the glass window. Some begged Karen to stop, while others recorded the scene on their phones, unable to believe what they were witnessing. But Karen didn't care. She was determined to prove a point, no matter how cruel or unnecessary it seemed. With trembling hands, Maya tried to shield herself, tears streaming down her face as chunks of her beautiful curls hit the floor. Each snip felt like a stab to her dignity, leaving her feeling exposed and humiliated. By the time Karen stepped back, satisfied with her work, Maya's once vibrant afro was reduced to uneven patches and bare scalp. The room fell silent except for Maya's quiet sobs, which echoed painfully in the tense atmosphere. What Karen didn't realize in that moment was that she had crossed a line far bigger than any rulebook. Her actions weren't just about enforcing a policy, they were rooted in prejudice and ignorance. And as news of the incident spread like wildfire, the entire town would soon learn just how much damage one person's arrogance could cause. Little did Karen know, her reckless decision would lead her straight into a storm she couldn't possibly prepare for, and reveal secrets about Maya's life that would change everything. Maya walked home that afternoon, her head bowed and her heart heavy. The once bright confidence in her stride was replaced by slow, hesitant steps. She could feel the stares of strangers on the street, their eyes lingering on her newly shaved head. Some whispered behind cupped hands, while others simply looked away, unsure of what to say. Maya clenched her fists tightly, refusing to let anyone see her cry. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction, not after what she'd been through. When she finally reached her house, Maya hesitated before opening the door. Her mom, Angela, was standing in the kitchen when she heard the creak of the front door. At first glance, Angela froze, her hand still gripping the edge of a dish towel. "Maya," she called out, her voice trembling slightly. When Maya stepped into view, Angela dropped the towel and rushed over, covering her mouth with both hands as tears welled up in her eyes. "Baby, what happened to your hair?" Maya tried to speak but couldn't find the words. Instead, she collapsed into her mother's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Angela held her tightly, stroking her back and murmuring comforting words, though she already knew the answer deep down. Maya eventually managed to choke out the story between sobs. How the principal had called her out, how Officer Karen had taken things too far, and how no one had listened to her side. Every word felt like a punch to Angela's chest, but she stayed strong for her daughter. "You didn't deserve this," Angela said firmly, wiping away her own tears. No one should ever treat you like this. Maya nodded weakly, leaning against her mom for support. For a moment, they sat together in silence, letting the weight of the day settle around them. But then something shifted in Maya's expression. She straightened up, her dark eyes flashing with determination. "Mom, I'm not going to let her win," she said quietly but resolutely. "She doesn't get to take this from me." Angela smiled softly, pride swelling in her heart despite the pain of the situation. "That's my girl," she replied, hugging Maya again. "We'll figure this out together." Later that evening, after Maya had gone to bed, Angela picked up the phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in months. On the other end of the line, Derek Johnson answered. He sounded tired but attentive. A man who had spent years fighting battles bigger than himself. "Hey, Angie," he greeted warmly. "What's going on?" Angela took a deep breath before speaking. "It's Maya," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "Something terrible happened today at school." As she recounted the events of the day, Derek's tone changed from casual concern to icy resolve. By the time she finished, he was silent for a long moment, processing everything. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Don't worry, Angie. I'll handle it." Derek may have lived abroad for years, building a reputation as one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country, but he had always kept tabs on his family. Now, hearing about what had happened to his daughter reignited a fire within him. This wasn't just about Maya. It was about every child who had ever been made to feel less than because of who they were. And Officer Karen, well, she had no idea who she was dealing with. As Angela hung up the phone, she felt a glimmer of hope. Derek wasn't just any father. He was a force to be reckoned with. With him on their side, maybe, just maybe, they could turn this nightmare into something meaningful. Meanwhile, Maya lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She touched her shaved head gently, feeling the smoothness beneath her fingertips. It wasn't the way she wanted to look, but it didn't define her. If anything, it reminded her of her strength and the fight she was ready to take on. Unbeknownst to everyone else, including Officer Karen, the wheels of justice were already beginning to turn. What started as a cruel act of power would soon spiral into something much larger than anyone anticipated. And Maya, she was more prepared than anyone realized to face whatever came next. Officer Karen Miller strutted into the police station later that evening, her boots clicking against the tiled floor with an air of confidence. She tossed her hat onto the desk and leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as if she'd just completed a job well done. To her, shaving Maya's hair had been a necessary act, a lesson taught to enforce discipline and authority. She didn't see it as cruel or excessive. She saw it as sending a message, and in her mind, that made her untouchable. Her colleagues weren't so sure. Word about what had happened at the school had spread quickly, even within the station. Officers whispered among themselves, shaking their heads in disbelief. Some tried to confront Karen, asking why she'd gone so far. "Rules are rules," she snapped back, cutting them off before they could finish. "If we don't enforce them, how can anyone respect us?" Her tone left no room for argument, but the tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Karen wasn't blind to the murmurs around her, but she brushed them aside. In her eyes, these were just jealous coworkers who didn't have the guts to make tough calls like she did. Besides, she had bigger things to worry about, like making sure the higher-ups knew she was right. That evening, during roll call, Karen proudly recounted the incident to her commanding officer, framing it as a victory for law and order. "I put that girl in her place," she declared, her voice loud and unapologetic. Sometimes you have to show people there are consequences. But not everyone bought her bravado. One younger officer, Officer Ramirez, spoke up hesitantly. "Ma'am, I think this might blow up in our faces," he said cautiously. "People are already talking online. Videos are popping up everywhere." Karen rolled her eyes, dismissing his concerns with a wave of her hand. "Let them talk," she scoffed. "By tomorrow, they'll forget all about it. She couldn't have been more wrong. By midnight, social media platforms were ablaze with outrage. Videos of the incident, shot by horrified students on their phones, had gone viral. Hashtags like #JusticeForMaya and #StopRacism trended across the country, drawing attention from activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens alike. Comment sections flooded with messages of support for Maya and condemnation for Karen's actions. People shared personal stories of similar experiences, turning the spotlight onto systemic issues of bias and discrimination. Back at the station, Karen remained oblivious to the growing storm. She spent the next morning scrolling through local news websites, smugly satisfied when articles framed her as a figure of authority standing firm against unruly behavior. What she failed to notice were the subtle shifts in tone. Even mainstream outlets began questioning whether her actions had crossed ethical lines. A few reporters reached out to the police department for comment, but Karen shrugged them off, confident that her side of the story would prevail. It wasn't until mid-afternoon that cracks started to form in her armor. As she walked through the town square to grab lunch, she noticed something strange. People were avoiding her gaze. Shopkeepers who usually greeted her warmly now busied themselves behind counters, pretending not to see her approach. Even the barista at her favorite cafe handed over her coffee without meeting her eyes. For the first time, Karen felt a flicker of unease, but she quickly pushed it aside, telling herself it was all in her head. That night, however, reality hit hard. Sitting alone in her apartment, Karen decided to check social media for herself. At first, she scrolled casually, expecting to find exaggerated claims she could easily dismiss. But as she delved deeper, her stomach tightened. The sheer volume of anger directed at her was overwhelming. Photos of Maya before and after the incident were plastered everywhere, accompanied by captions calling her actions barbaric and racist. Petitions demanding her removal from the force had gathered thousands of signatures overnight. For the first time, doubt crept into Karen's mind. Could she have misjudged the situation? Was this really just about enforcing rules, or was there something else at play here, something she hadn't considered? As she stared at her laptop screen, a cold realization washed over her. Maybe, just maybe, she had made a mistake. But by then, it was too late to turn back. The world was watching, and the fraud was only beginning. The days following the viral explosion of Maya's story were nothing short of transformative, for both Maya and the town itself. What had started as a single act of cruelty quickly grew into a movement that united people from all walks of life. Social media played its part, amplifying voices that demanded justice for Maya and accountability for Officer Karen. But it wasn't just online where things were changing. The streets of the small town buzzed with energy as community members came together to show their support. Local activists wasted no time organizing rallies outside the school and police station. Hundreds gathered, holding signs that read "Hair is not a crime" and "Stand with Maya." The crowd was diverse, young and old, black and white, students and parents, all standing shoulder to shoulder in solidarity. Maya attended one of these rallies, her shaved head held high despite the nervous flutter in her chest. When she stepped onto the makeshift stage, the crowd erupted into cheers. For a moment, she stood there silently, overwhelmed by the love and support surrounding her. When Maya finally spoke, her voice trembled at first, but soon steadied as she poured her heart out. "I didn't ask for this," she began, gesturing to her bald head. "Nobody deserves to be treated like they're less than human because of who they are or what they look like. My hair is part of me. It's part of my culture, my identity. And no one has the right to take that away." Her words struck a chord, drawing applause and tears from the audience. She ended her speech by thanking everyone for standing with her, promising to keep fighting not just for herself, but for others who might face similar injustices. Word of Maya's bravery spread far beyond the town limits. National organizations dedicated to civil rights and racial equality reached out to offer their support. Lawyers volunteered to help build a case against Officer Karen, while advocacy groups raised funds to cover legal fees. Even celebrities joined the conversation, using their platforms to amplify Maya's story. The pressure mounted on local authorities to take action, and the school district found itself under intense scrutiny for allowing such an incident to occur. Behind the scenes, Maya's father, Derek Johnson, worked tirelessly to ensure justice would be served. Known for his sharp mind and unshakable determination, Derek gathered evidence meticulously: videos, witness statements, policy documents, and prepared to file formal complaints against both Officer Karen and the school administration. He also reached out to trusted allies in the media, ensuring the narrative stayed focused on systemic issues rather than devolving into sensationalism. Meanwhile, Maya's mother, Angela, became a pillar of strength for their family and the community. She organized donation drives to provide resources for families affected by discriminatory practices, emphasizing education and empowerment. Together, the Johnsons transformed their pain into purpose, inspiring others to do the same. Even within the police department, cracks began to form. Some officers privately admitted they disagreed with Karen's actions, calling them excessive and unnecessary. A few even offered anonymous tips to investigators, revealing past incidents where Karen had displayed similar behavior. Though hesitant to speak publicly, these whistleblowers played a crucial role in building the case against her. As the momentum continued to grow, Maya realized something profound. She wasn't alone. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It belonged to everyone who believed in fairness, dignity, and respect. The support she received gave her strength, fueling her resolve to see this through to the end. And though the road ahead wouldn't be easy, Maya knew one thing for certain. The world was watching now, and there was no turning back. The day of the press conference arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. Reporters from local news stations, national outlets, and even international media packed into the small community center where Derek Johnson had called the meeting. Cameras flashed, microphones were adjusted, and notebooks flipped open as everyone waited for the man who had become the face of this growing movement. Maya sat quietly beside her father, her hands folded neatly in her lap, trying to steady her breathing. She knew this moment would be pivotal, not just for her, but for countless others watching. Derek stepped up to the podium, his presence commanding yet calm. He wore a suit that fit him perfectly, exuding professionalism and authority. But more than anything, it was his eyes that caught everyone's attention. Sharp, focused, and filled with purpose. As he began to speak, the room fell silent. "My name is Derek Johnson," he said, his deep voice resonating through the space. "And today I stand before you not only as a father, but as an advocate for justice." He paused briefly, letting his words sink in before continuing. "What happened to my daughter, Maya, was not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a much larger problem. A problem rooted in prejudice, ignorance, and systemic inequality." He gestured toward Maya, who nodded slightly, her expression steady despite the weight of the moment. Maya did nothing wrong. Her hair was not a distraction. It was a celebration of her identity. Yet, because of someone else's biases, she was humiliated in front of her peers and stripped of her dignity. Derek then turned to the evidence. On a large screen behind him, video footage played on loop. Footage showing Officer Karen's aggressive behavior, the tears streaming down Maya's face, and the horrified reactions of students witnessing the scene. The room grew tense as the clips rolled, some reporters audibly gasping or shaking their heads. Derek explained each frame, pointing out how Karen's actions violated policies, ethical standards, and basic human decency. To drive his point home, Derek invited experts to speak next. A cultural historian discussed the significance of natural hairstyles in Black communities, emphasizing how they are deeply tied to heritage and self-expression. A psychologist spoke about the emotional impact such acts of humiliation can have on young people, particularly those from marginalized groups. Their testimonies painted a clear picture. This wasn't just about hair. It was about respect, humanity, and the right to exist without fear of discrimination. When it was Maya's turn to speak, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. She stood slowly, adjusting the microphone to her height, and looked directly into the crowd. "I'm here because I want people to understand what happened to me," she began, her voice soft but steady. "But I'm also here because I don't want anyone else to feel the way I did that day. No one should ever have to go through something like this." She recounted the events in detail, the confusion, the fear, the shame, and described how she felt afterward. "For a long time, I thought maybe I deserved it," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "Maybe I had done something wrong. But now I know that's not true. What happened to me wasn't fair, and it wasn't right. And if sharing my story helps even one person realize they aren't alone, then all of this will be worth it." As Maya finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. People wiped away tears, while others nodded in agreement, visibly moved by her courage. Derek placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, pride shining in his eyes. Then he delivered the final blow. Officer Karen Miller may have thought she was enforcing rules, but what she actually did was expose the cracks in a system that continues to fail so many. We will not rest until there is accountability for her, for the school, and for anyone else complicit in perpetuating these injustices. Outside the community center, the fallout was immediate. News outlets broadcasted the press conference live, spreading Maya's story to millions around the world. Social media lit up again, with hashtags trending once more. Calls for action flooded into the police department and school district, demanding transparency and reform. For the first time, Officer Karen realized the enormity of her mistake. Sitting at home, glued to the coverage, she felt a chill run down her spine as she watched Derek's piercing gaze on screen. In that moment, she understood. She had no idea who she was dealing with. And now, it was too late to undo the damage she had caused. The disciplinary hearing for Officer Karen Miller took place in a small, stark room at the police station. The air was heavy with tension as she sat alone at one end of the table, her hands clasped tightly together. Across from her were members of the disciplinary panel, their faces unreadable as they shuffled through documents and reviewed evidence. Maya and her father, Derek, sat nearby, flanked by supporters who had come to witness the proceedings. Reporters weren't allowed inside, but the weight of public scrutiny loomed over everyone present. When the hearing began, Derek rose to speak first. His voice was calm yet commanding as he laid out the case against Karen. He presented video footage, expert testimonies, and written statements from witnesses, all meticulously organized to paint a damning picture of her actions. This wasn't about enforcing rules, Derek said firmly, his eyes locked on the panel. It was an abuse of power fueled by bias. What happened to my daughter cannot be excused or ignored. Next, it was Maya's turn to testify. Though visibly nervous, she spoke with quiet strength, recounting every detail of that fateful day. She described how Karen had dismissed her protests, how the scissors felt like weapons in her hands, and how the act of shaving her hair left her feeling stripped of her identity. Her words hung in the air, raw and unfiltered, forcing everyone in the room to confront the human cost of Karen's decisions. When she finished, there was a long silence, broken only by the faint sound of someone shifting uncomfortably in their seat. Finally, it was Karen's turn to defend herself. She stood slowly, her usual bravado replaced by unease. For weeks, she had rehearsed what she would say, convinced she could justify her actions. But now, standing under the weight of so many accusing stares, her confidence faltered. "I was just doing my job," she started, her voice trembling. "Enforcing the rules, maintaining order." Her excuses sounded hollow even to her own ears. Derek interjected gently but firmly. "Maintaining order, or imposing your own biases under the guise of authority?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Karen hesitated, unable to respond. The panel pressed her further, asking why she hadn't followed proper protocol or sought guidance before taking such drastic measures. Each question chipped away at her defenses until she was left with nothing but fragments of justification that no one believed. After hours of deliberation, the verdict came down swiftly and decisively. Karen was terminated from her position with immediate effect, and criminal charges, including assault and misconduct, were recommended for prosecution. As the panel delivered their ruling, Karen slumped back into her chair, her face pale. It was over. Her career, once a source of pride, had crumbled in front of her. Outside the station, news of the decision spread quickly. Supporters gathered in the parking lot, cheering and chanting Maya's name as she stepped out alongside her family. Cameras flashed, capturing the moment when Maya raised her hand in a small wave, her shaved head held high. Derek addressed the crowd briefly, thanking them for their unwavering support and vowing to continue fighting for systemic change. "This is not the end," he declared. "It's only the beginning." For Karen, the aftermath was isolating. Stripped of her badge and facing potential jail time, she retreated from public life. Friends distanced themselves, and former colleagues avoided mentioning her name. At home, she spent sleepless nights replaying the events in her mind, haunted by the realization that her actions had caused irreparable harm. Yet, amid the shame and regret, a flicker of self-awareness began to emerge. She started attending workshops on racial sensitivity and volunteering with marginalized youth groups, though few believed her efforts were genuine. Back at the rally, Maya hugged her mom tightly, tears streaming down her face, not from sadness this time, but from relief and gratitude. Justice had been served, but more importantly, she had found her voice. And as she looked out at the sea of smiling faces cheering her on, Maya knew she had sparked something bigger than herself, a movement that would inspire others to stand up, speak out, and demand respect. In the weeks following her termination, Officer Karen Miller became a ghost of her former self. Once known for her rigid demeanor and unshakable confidence, she now moved through life with a quiet unease, avoiding eye contact with neighbors and steering clear of public spaces where she might be recognized. The weight of what she had done, and the consequences that followed, pressed down on her like a shadow she couldn't escape. Her days were spent in solitude, replaying the disciplinary hearing in her mind, haunted by Maya's tearful testimony and Derek's piercing gaze. At first, Karen tried to convince herself that she was the victim, that the world had turned against her unfairly. But as time passed, she found it harder to cling to those excuses. Late at night, alone in her dimly lit apartment, she would sit by the window and stare out into the darkness, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. It wasn't just losing her job or facing criminal charges. It was the realization that her actions had caused real pain to someone innocent. For the first time in years, Karen began to question not just what she had done, but who she was. One day, while scrolling through social media, Karen stumbled upon a video clip of Maya speaking at another rally. In the footage, Maya stood confidently before a cheering crowd, her shaved head now growing back into short curls. She spoke passionately about resilience, forgiveness, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Watching Maya's words, Karen felt a lump rise in her throat. Here was a girl who had every reason to hate her, yet instead of harboring bitterness, Maya chose to focus on hope and healing. Something inside Karen shifted. She realized that if Maya could find strength after such an ordeal, maybe there was still a chance for her too. Slowly, tentatively, Karen began taking steps toward change. She enrolled in workshops focused on racial sensitivity and bias training, though she often felt out of place among participants who seemed more open-minded than she was. At times, she considered quitting, overwhelmed by feelings of guilt and inadequacy. But something kept pushing her forward, a desire to make amends, however small they might seem. Karen also started volunteering at a local youth center, working with children from marginalized communities. Initially, the kids eyed her warily, unsure of what to make of this unfamiliar face. But over time, Karen earned their trust by showing genuine interest in their lives. She listened to their stories, shared meals with them, and even helped organize activities aimed at building self-esteem. Though she never mentioned her past publicly, some of the older teens eventually pieced together who she was. To her surprise, rather than shunning her, many expressed cautious optimism about her efforts to grow. Meanwhile, Maya continued to inspire those around her. Her advocacy work gained momentum, drawing attention from national leaders and organizations dedicated to combating systemic racism. She traveled to conferences, schools, and community events, sharing her story and encouraging others to embrace their identities without fear. Despite her growing fame, Maya remained grounded, always crediting her family and supporters for helping her stay strong during difficult times. When asked whether she forgave Karen, Maya's response was thoughtful. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting," she said during one interview. "It's about choosing to move forward, not for her sake, but for mine. I don't want anger or hatred to define me. That's why I'm focusing on creating change, so no one else has to go through what I did." Karen heard these words during a televised segment and felt a deep pang of emotion. Forgiveness wasn't something she expected or necessarily deserved, but knowing that Maya had chosen to rise above bitterness gave Karen a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible, even for someone like her. Though skeptical voices remained, some within the community noticed Karen's gradual transformation. While opinions about her varied widely, one thing became clear: the incident had forced everyone involved, including Karen, to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and the world they lived in. And as painful as that process was, it planted seeds of growth that would continue to bloom long after the headlines faded away. Months had passed since the incident, and life in the small town began to settle into a new rhythm. The scars of that painful chapter still lingered, but they were slowly being replaced by signs of healing and progress. For Maya Johnson, the journey had come full circle as she stood on stage at her high school graduation, wearing a bright smile and a cap adorned with sparkling beads that matched her now thick curls. Her hair, once cruelly taken from her, had grown back into a crown of resilience, a symbol of everything she had overcome. As valedictorian, Maya was tasked with delivering the final speech of the ceremony. The crowd fell silent as she stepped up to the podium, her presence commanding attention without saying a word. She looked out at the sea of faces, her family sitting proudly in the front row, her friends cheering quietly, teachers nodding in encouragement, and even strangers who had followed her story online. Taking a deep breath, Maya began to speak. "Graduation is supposed to be about celebrating accomplishments," she said, her voice steady and warm. "But for me, it's also about gratitude, for every person who stood by me when I needed them most." She paused, glancing down briefly before continuing. "When someone tried to take away my identity, you reminded me who I am. You showed me that strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up again and again." Maya went on to talk about the lessons she'd learned, the power of community, the importance of speaking out against injustice, and the value of forgiveness, not just for others, but for oneself. "What happened to me wasn't fair," she admitted, her tone softening. "But it taught me something important. We can let pain define us, or we can use it to create change. And I choose change." The audience erupted into applause, rising to their feet as Maya stepped back from the podium. Tears streamed down Angela's face as Derek wrapped an arm around her shoulders, both of them beaming with pride. Maya's courage had not only transformed her own life, but had inspired countless others to stand tall in the face of adversity. Meanwhile, Karen Miller watched the graduation ceremony from afar, standing near the edge of the crowd where no one would notice her. She hadn't been invited, nor did she expect to be, but she felt compelled to see Maya one last time. As Maya delivered her speech, Karen listened intently, her heart heavy yet hopeful. Hearing those words, spoken with such grace and wisdom, was a reminder of how far she herself had come since that fateful day. While she knew she could never undo the harm she had caused, she hoped that her efforts to grow and give back might someday contribute to a better world. In the months that followed, the town continued to evolve. The school district implemented new policies designed to celebrate diversity rather than suppress it, including protections for cultural hairstyles. Officers within the police department underwent mandatory training sessions on bias and empathy, thanks in part to recommendations made during Karen's disciplinary hearing. Though change didn't happen overnight, the seeds of transformation had been planted, nurtured by the voices of those brave enough to demand justice. For Maya, life moved forward in exciting ways. She earned a scholarship to a prestigious university, where she planned to study law, inspired by her father's dedication to fighting inequality. Before leaving for college, she visited the youth center where Karen volunteered, surprising everyone by offering words of encouragement to the children there. "Never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong," she told them, her voice filled with conviction. "You are exactly who you're meant to be." Karen, watching from across the room, felt a quiet sense of peace. She knew she would always carry the weight of her mistakes, but seeing Maya extend kindness, even indirectly, gave her hope that redemption was possible. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was a start. As Maya boarded the bus to begin her next adventure, she glanced back at her hometown one last time. The place that had once felt so suffocating now seemed smaller, lighter somehow, as if the shadows of the past were finally lifting. With a deep breath, she turned forward, ready to embrace whatever came next. And somewhere, miles away, Karen smiled faintly as she packed supplies for another day at the youth center. Two lives, forever intertwined by pain and resilience, moving toward brighter futures, one step at a time.